It seems like every year something happens, and the idea that the US dollar is collapsing and is going to lose its status as the world reserve currency causes fear everywhere. Most videos will give you extreme views that the dollar is collapsing, that there's a bubble, that the economy is going to crash, we're in a recession, depression.
But fear porn is just real.
But in reality, the world doesn't operate in these extremes, but in variations. The economy ebbs and flows, sometimes it's higher, sometimes it's lower, and right now we're in a normal stage where the economy is slowing. And that doesn't mean that it's going to crash and that it's all over. Now, before we get into the world reserve currencies and if the US is actually losing its status, let's take a look at the history of world reserve currencies. So let's take a trip down memory lane to the 1450s when the Portuguese real was the world reserve currency. That was until they got invaded in the 1500s by the Spanish. And then around 1640, the Dutch came along and invaded Spain, and then they became the world reserve currency holder. And then again in 1720, the French invaded the Dutch, and then the French became the world reserve currency holder. And the French reign didn't last long either, as England invaded France in 1815 and as a result took over the position as the world reserve currency. Now before we continue, if you're enjoying this video, please give it a like, subscribe to the channel. It really helps me out and I really appreciate it. So we're in the 1850s, England is the world superpower and holds the world reserve currency. So how did the US become the world reserve currency holder? Well, during World War I, England needed funding to pay for the war. So what they did was they exchanged gold for weapons from the US. And this continued until the end of World War II, by which time the US had the majority of the world's gold. They had 2/3 of all the gold in the world. Fast forward to 1944, and 44 countries from around the world came together to the US to sign the Bretton Woods Agreement. This agreement essentially made the US dollar the world reserve currency of the world. And the two main reasons that they did that was, one, the US held the most gold, and also they were the world's superpower. They had the largest economy at the time, and still do. And so why would these countries decide to make the US dollar the reserve currency? Because it makes it easier for everyone to trade. Let's say you're China and you want to trade with Russia. Well, you're China and you don't want Russian ruble, and Russia doesn't want Chinese yuan, so what happens? So instead, they'll hold on to US dollars in reserve. So essentially, you've got the Russian government, you've got the Chinese government, and they're holding US dollars in their bank accounts. And so when they need to make trades, let's say Russia needs to pay China, instead of Russia paying in ruble, what they'll do is that ruble will get converted into US dollars. And so when it reaches the Chinese, they receive it as US dollars. And then they can decide if they want to keep it as US dollars or if they want to convert it back into yuan to use in their own economy. Now back to 1944, and when all these countries are together, what they do is they create the IMF, so the International Monetary Fund, and also they create the World Bank. And this is really the start of the US's grasp on the whole world. Because by creating these organizations, it just creates more influence for the US around the world, and it really is the beginning of the US as the world's superpower. Okay, now we're gonna fast forward a little bit more again, and this time we're in 1971. And at this time, Nixon is president and takes the US off the gold standard. So instead of the US dollar being backed by gold, the US dollar is now backed by the full faith and credit of the US government. And the main reason that the US did this was because they were spending a lot of money. And by getting off the gold standard, they were able to print more money. And this is done mostly because the US was spending a lot and needed a way to print money. Now you might be thinking, well, this is going to take away all the efforts of the Bretton Woods Agreement when the US dollar was backed by gold. But in fact, the Bretton Woods Agreement was so big and had such an influence that even till today, it still carries a lot of influence. And it allowed the US dollar to maintain its position in the world. In fact, the formation of OPEC was basically where the US decided that oil would be bought and sold in US dollars. So when the US needs to buy oil from Saudi Arabia, it buys it in US dollars. So imagine that all that oil that the US is buying, Saudi Arabia has a ton of US dollars in their reserve because of that. And that's where the name for the petrodollar originally came from. And because of this, any country that wants to buy oil has to buy it in US dollars. So again, because of this, the US continues to have influence around the world, and countries are reliant on the US and the US dollar. Okay, so that was a lot of history and a lot of numbers, but you might have noticed that about every 100 years or so, the world reserve currency changes. And for the US, Since World War II, it's now been over 100 years. And so you might be thinking this is the perfect time for BRICS to come in, which stands for Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, for them to come in and take over as the world reserve currency. Especially with all these talks about them coming in and buying oil in their own currency and boycotting the US dollar. But if we dig into it further, all they're really doing is creating a currency that they can trade amongst each other. Very similar to what Europe did with the euro. And so you might be thinking, well, if all these countries come together and create a new currency, the BRICS, and so this might be the start of the fall of the US dollar, but we saw what happened with the euro. It had barely any impact on the US dollar as the world reserve currency. And if we take into account the size of the economies of the BRICS, even then, they're not big enough that they would have that much influence around the world and overthrow the US dollar.
Because while they do take up a lot of land mass, they do not take up a lot of the gross domestic product of the world. The United States still is the vast majority of the gross domestic product of the world. China is big, and Brazil is in a failed economy like times 10, and is tiny as far as economics go. Texas has a higher GDP than Brazil.
Also, on a side note, I feel like the amount of times I've said world reserve currency or US dollar or world power, I don't think I've ever said those words this many times ever. Okay, so there's a bunch of reasons why the US dollar might be near the end of its reign. It's been over 100 years. All these countries are coming together like the BRICS to overthrow the US dollar. But even with that, I really don't think that the end of the US dollar is anywhere close. And that's because there's essentially 3 criteria that determines what the world reserve currency is. The first one is that it generally belongs to the largest economy and an economy that is growing. Now, many years ago, the thought was that China or Russia would overtake the US economy, especially with China as they were growing so rapidly at the time. And the idea and the prediction that China would overtake the US has been going on for years.
Some decades to come, I think China and the United States will be the 2 super economic powers.
Especially since China grew so quickly from a low income to a medium income country and pulling off the impossible and bringing millions, hundreds of millions of people into the middle class. But now the situation has changed. Since China implemented the one-child policy, they really messed up and screwed themselves royally.
We fucked up.
Because of that, the growth rate of their economy is starting to slow. In fact, some are saying that it's declining, and also their birth rate is decreasing rapidly. And on the flip side, the US is going to continue to grow as that's where all the high-paying tech jobs are. People from around the world want to go to the US for these jobs. Versus China consists mostly of manufacturing jobs. And then there's also the talk of the Petro Yuan that China is going to start buying oil in yuan instead of US dollars. But again, if we take a look at how much yuan there is in reserve around the world, it's less than 3%. Meanwhile, the US has the majority with almost 60. And even if, let's say, the BRICS created their currency and started buying oil in that currency instead of US dollars, again, the US has so many allies around the world that they would continue to buy oil in US dollars. And I really don't think that they would go against the US and start trading or start buying oil in their own currencies. And the second one is political and legal system. So while I think the US still has a long way to go, there's definitely many laws and rules that I don't agree with, but they're still one of the best legal systems, especially for business. For example, in China, there's a lot of people that once they got wealthy, they started to export their money outside of China and into countries like the US and Canada because they didn't trust the systems to keep their money safe in China. And so that's why they bought all this real estate on the West Coast. And also think about what happened when the government decided to dig into Alibaba and Jack Ma. Jack Ma spoke up against the government, and what they did essentially resulted in Jack Ma going into hiding because his life was at risk. Now that's not a system in which you want to run a business. And the last one is military. Now the US outspends almost every other country in the world, and you can really see that as they have military bases everywhere. And that really helps to maintain their influence and control in those regions. But what if everything I'm saying is wrong and the US does actually end up losing its status as the world reserve currency? What then? Well, if that happens, then the US economy is essentially going to collapse. And that means, do you end up moving to one of the other countries that becomes the world superpower? Do you move to China, to Russia, to South Africa? And also think about it, if that happens, you don't have to worry about how you're investing because the US dollar is gonna be gone. And along with that, some of the biggest and most innovative companies will also be gone, like Apple, Google, Microsoft, Tesla. These are all companies that likely will go away if the US lost its status as the world reserve currency. And the reason for that is you have to really think about what would need to happen around the world for that to happen, for the US to lose its status.
If the central bank collapses in America, you need bullets because all hell's going to break loose.
I was going to say bottled water.
Bottled water and bullets.
Now let's say that is the world that we end up living in. What do you do to thrive in such an environment, and what can you do to prepare for it today? Well, I love what Warren Buffett says, that the best investment is in yourself. Economic slowdown or not, US being the world reserve currency or not, the best thing that you can do is to make sure that your financial house is in order. Invest in yourself and maximize your earnings. Let's say you're a baker. If you're a baker, you want to be the best baker in town. So that way, if the US dollar goes away and you can't sell for money, you can then maybe do exchange instead. You give someone your bread and someone gives you, let's say, vegetables in exchange. Outside of that, you could invest in physical assets like real estate. So again, if you have real estate, you can maybe rent out rooms or rent out houses. And exchange, people will give you, let's say you rent it out to a baker, they'll give you bread, or a farmer, they'll give you vegetables, and then that way you have food to live off of. For me, I'm not betting against the US economy or capitalism. While the US does have its problems, it's not perfect, it's still, in my opinion, one of the best places to invest. It's very business friendly. So if you're looking to start a business, you want to invest in a business in the stock market, I think the US is the best place to do that. And so what I'm doing is continuing to invest every day, day in, day out. And I think that's the best we can do because at the end of the day, we don't really know what's going to happen. So I would continue to invest. And I think eventually the US will probably lose its status. But again, I think we're decades away from that ever happening. I don't think it'll happen in our lifetime. So I think we're safe, as long as nothing crazy happens. But let me know if there's something that you want me to dig further into, if you want me to do a deep dive. Let me know in the comments below. Otherwise, I will see you next week.